Welcome, everybody, to the Demeter Salon, which is part of the IMOS 2021 conference. This year's conference theme is Building Racial Equity, in and across motherhood. And Demeter Press and IMOS, of course, has a very close relationship and has in part because IMOS has been an extension or a rebirth, I should say, of Mercy, which was all founded and head up by Andrea O'Reilly, who is here tonight with us, and we'll be talking about Demeter Press as a whole, but also some of the specific anthologies that she has shepherded through the process, along with several other editors and authors that will be joining with us. So we have, I'm going to go through a very quick sort of list of the books and editors that will be with us tonight. And then each of you will hopefully have a chance to introduce yourselves, fill the audience in terms of why you're here, what you published, all of that good stuff, where you may be in the world. And then from there, we'll have a little bit more of an in-depth conversation amongst ourselves. Certainly feel free to use the chat box to chime in with comments or questions, and we'll save the last several minutes for direct questions and an exchange with those of you who've decided to join us this evening. So tonight we'll be addressing the books Monstrous Mothers, Troubling Tropes. The editors are Abigail, Palko, and Andrea O'Reilly. The second is Mothers, Mothering, and COVID-19, Dispatches from a Pandemic, with editors Fiona Joy Green and Andrea O'Reilly. The third is Global Perspectives on Motherhood, Mothering, and Masculinity. The editors are Tolu Pearce, and Andrea Moraes. Tolu will be joining us tonight, but not her co-editor. Mothering and Welfare, Depriving, Surviving, and Thriving, with editors Karine, Levasseur, Stephanie Paterson, and Lorna A. Turnbull. Dr. Turnbull will be joining us tonight. Matricentric Feminism, Theory, Activism, and Practice, the second edition, and Maternal Theory and Essential Readings, the second edition. Both of those were edited by Andrea O'Reilly, of course. So at this point, Andrea, being that you have been the mother of the press and the mother of so many of these books, I thought I would start off with you. And then as you finish up what you would like to say as an introduction, if you can choose the next person that you would like to hand that off to, we can introduce ourselves so that we know who's in this space and learn a little bit more about you.
Am I okay? I'm unmuted. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Katie, for your generosity and once again having a Demeter panel as part of this conference. I know last year we had 2 panels, and I think they were hugely successful. There was great conversations and debates and discussions. So thank you again for having Demeter join you. What to say about Demeter? Demeter, I think you all know, so I don't need to say much, but it was in 2006 that Demeter was birthed. We are now in our 15th year in 2021. It's kind of hard to believe. And the origins of Demeter, or the reasons for it, I suppose, are similar to why I started the Journal of Motherhood Initiative, much earlier in '99. But I heard, time and time again from scholars, both, beginning their career, but even very established scholars saying, I need a home for my work. Mainstream, and this has become even more so since 06 to 221, because now I'm in the publishing business and know firsthand, in the publishing world, it's, very much driven by the bottom line, and understandably, right? Either they're corporate presses that make money by selling bestsellers, or they're presses hugely or completely dependent on funding, and then have to be very selective on what they decide to, put forward to get that funding. And I just heard from time to time again that important research on motherhood was simply not being published, not because it wasn't good, not because people weren't interested, not that it wouldn't be used in courses, and not that a lot of people wouldn't buy it, but publishers weren't willing to take those titles on because either they needed the economies of scale, they needed, to sell 3,000 of them, to make it profitable, and or they are administered by universities that, dictated what they could publish. So as a result, a lot of works on motherhood were squeezed out, right? So it was like I just felt we needed a place you know, to publish this important work that's being done. And no one else was going to do it, right? Not because they were bad people, it's just because of the politics of publishing. So that's why I founded Demeter in 06. In the beginning, we were very modest. I think we did 2 books our first year, maybe 3 our second year. And now we do between 12 and 16 titles a year. And I know, I can say with utmost certainty that a significant number of our titles would never have been published if it wasn't for Demeter Press. I mean, I'm not bragging, but I just know that a corporate or university press would not have published them. They wouldn't have sold enough or wouldn't have met the mandate of that particular university press. So, you know, we have published now, I think we're at, I should have counted before tonight, but I think we're around 160 titles we've published since 06. And, you know, and some, actually a lot, make no money, right? You know, but it doesn't mean they're not important, right? They need to be in the world, right? And libraries buy them and people read them and they may buy them on ebooks, but we certainly very rarely ever cover the cost of production because of the high cost of production with each title, right? But that, you know, so thankfully we have a small grant that helps. And thankfully we have very loyal readers who buy copies and tell their aunt to buy a copy, and maybe 4. So yeah, for me, it was just the necessity of getting this research out into the world, and it wasn't out in the world. And I just fundamentally believe it needs to be out in the world. So that's the origins of Demeter Press. And I have to say, as many of you know me personally, COVID was devastating and remains devastating on the publishing world. And it's devastating because, well, for a long time, books weren't even being sold in the early months. But more than that, what's happening is because of COVID, classes are now remote. So university professors are no longer ordering course texts. So before we'd count on, you know, a course instructor ordering, you know, 30 books for his course or her course, everything's now online, and we don't get any payment for that, right? It's the copyright in Canada, it's anyway, it's before the courts, but so far the publishers are losing. So it's been really hard on not just me, every publisher is hanging on by a tether right now. It's gotten a bit better, but it has been a hard slog the last 20 months under COVID with publishers. But, you know, we did publish 15 titles during the pandemic, of which we're relieved and grateful. But yeah, I just do it because I think this stuff has to be out in the world, fundamentally, completely, unequivocally. And I think it needs to be out in the world even more now with the pandemic and the world that it seems to be becoming, which isn't it for me, it seems even worse now than it did in the beginning in terms of, you know, the backlash to the gains that women have made. So that's a really depressing preamble. I'm sorry, but I just think it's just a necessity. And so I'm very honored that so many of our editors are here, and they do this work out of love and passion. They're not getting paid for any of this, and several of the books were published during the pandemic. And you know, my gosh, it was just. Yeah, it was touch and go at times, whether we thought these books would ever see the light of day with all the setbacks. There was huge issues with supply chains, and oh my gosh, there was paper, we couldn't get paper for a while. There was just no paper because I don't know why there was no paper. And then we couldn't get our books published. And then there was, you know, the mail's been hugely delayed because of pandemic protocols. Books were taking forever to get to anybody, but we survived and we've come out the other end. So yeah, we persevered, and thank you for my editors, Demeter's editors, to keep doing the work despite the conditions under which they did it. So thank you. I don't know who to begin. I guess we can do in chronological order, I suppose. I guess we can go to Lorna. She published her book before the pandemic, but then her book became really relevant because of the pandemic. So I'll pass it off to Lorna. I mean, just to introduce, is this the point, Katie, that just to say a few words about their book at this point? Okay.
So we're not, this is our 3 to 5 minute talk about the book. Okay, yeah. Good. So I'm Lorna Turnbull, and I'm speaking to you this evening from Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg. And behind me, you see a sculpture by the name of Mimama, which means my mother in Cree and in Anishinaabe, actually. So it's important to me in starting to let you know where I am. This matters. Winnipegik ostesima wasanaitan peak, nehia aski otinina. And in saying that, I have just introduced myself in my very rudimentary Cree, to tell you that I'm here in Winnipeg on the lands that are covered by Treaty 1. And I'm here as a first generation Canadian, but I benefit from the treaties on this land. And where I am is the original homelands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And given the themes of this year's conference, I thought it was important to particularly emphasize that. I've been working with Demeter, or I began working with Demeter because Andrea asked me to. I've been working with Andrea, though, for more than 2 decades. Mm-hmm. When she said, you know, I have this idea for a book on mothering and welfare, or mothers and welfare, I think is what it was originally called, actually. I'm wondering, you know, would you think about being an editor? And I actually had somebody in mind that I might co-edit with, and then she wasn't available. And anyway, I found a couple of fantastic co-editors. One of them, Karine Levasseur, is a colleague here at the University of Manitoba, and the other a colleague at Concordia University in Montreal. But what excited me about this possibility of doing a book for Demeter was knowing, because I know Andrea, that there would be scope to look at the topic from a variety of perspectives and using different modalities. And so this is a collection that has fiction and poetry and art, along with quantitative and qualitative research. And so it was a very rewarding and satisfying collection to work on. We began with an absolute and unequivocal commitment to an inclusive vision of who does mother work. And I want to start by pointing out, you know, you'll have seen it in the promotional material, and it probably won't show up well if I do that. Yeah, it does. The cover. So the cover was really our effort to try and capture that inclusive vision. It was painted, it's from an oil painting by Corey Hardiman, a mother of 4 and painter living in British Columbia. And what we wanted to do was convey the work and care of mothering without attaching a particular kind of mother to that image. And that's pretty tough to do. So happily, we stumbled upon this work. And what Corey says about nests, because this particular image is called Drowning Nest, but she has a whole series of images of nests, is that they are, in her view, entirely about nurturance and love. And with respect to the drowning, this one's fallen out of the tree and is in the water. She said, well, you know, it's a precarious state. Here we are. It's sort of like, this is the reality. And of course, she's right. This is the reality. And so that was an important part of starting point, that idea that we could include imagery that was inclusive, that the work that's inside the volume is inclusive, mattered to us a lot. So we started from the point of view that mother work, while done mainly by mothers, is not done only by mothers, but is also done by fathers or other mothers or queer parents and other related people. At the same time, we wanted to acknowledge, and many of the pieces definitely show, that the impact of mother work is gendered, and it creates a gender inequality. We also had different ideas about welfare. So the word welfare contained for us a double entendre of well-being, thinking about the mother's welfare, how were they thriving, hence thriving in the title, but also the social supports that various states put in place for various kinds of activities, and sometimes including mothering. So hence the notion of depriving, because of course, in the time of neoliberalism and austerity, we're always facing the impacts on families, on all of us, but of neoliberal politics and the retreat of the state. So those ideas were captured in our subtitle, calling it Depriving, Surviving, and Thriving. We didn't want to have only, all the doom and gloom, although I totally agree with what Andrea is saying, from a publishing point of view, where just generally the pandemic has had vicious impacts, not equally distributed. And it's important to keep that in mind. But we wanted to convey the resilience and strength of those who are doing mother work and the power of the motivation to keep doing it because of that love and nurturance. So as I was saying, the background to pretty much all the works in the collection is really that neoliberal world that we live in, austerity. And the book is organized into 3 sections. One speaks to depriving, one to surviving, and one to thriving. The subtitle of the part on depriving is Mothering in the Face of Austerity, and it contains chapters that look at young mothers who grew up within the child welfare system, mothers in the prison system, the impact of the attacks on healthcare in Trump's America on women and children, and the marginalization of rural and racialized women in Brazil. And it opens with an incredibly compelling poem that captures all of those themes in the pain of a mother whose child is hungry. The second part, subtitled Images of Mothering, looks at how gendered, racialized, ableist, hetero images of what a mother should be discipline those who are doing the work of mothering. And so there are chapters that look at media representations of the mompreneur in the British context, of Canadian welfare mothers about whom there are tropes very different from the powerful and damaging trope of the American welfare queen. And the kinds of expectations on immigrant mothers, mothers in developing countries, and the pervasive and toxic ideology of intensive mothering. The last section, Thriving, subtitled Reimagining Mothering, looks at reclaiming mothering and using mothering as a site of resistance, as has been clearly articulated in Black feminist and Indigenous feminist writings such as Collins and Anderson. And the chapters celebrate mothers who are seeking change, such as those living in low-income circumstances in Toronto, or indeed a colleague of mine challenging the school bus rules in Winnipeg that insisted that children could only be dropped off at home, where clearly there would be a parent, as opposed to at a daycare location because the parents were both parents otherwise engaged. An exploration of how anti-narratives allow us to retell an encounter with a welfare authority in an empowering way from the point of view of the mother looking for support. And pushing boundaries, making spaces for same-sex parents, as well as a piece arguing very vigorously for a basic income as a way forward for all mothering, but especially for those who are mothering with a disability. I just want to mention in closing the last chapter in the book, and I want to mention it to pick up the themes from my introduction at the beginning. The last chapter is called Storytelling Motherhood. And we in Canada are entering the first ever National Week for Truth and Reconciliation with a statutory holiday that marks the history of Canada's Indian residential schools. And the last chapter is written by someone who is another mother, as she describes herself, raising a child, an Indigenous child who came into her care, but whose care she really shares with that child's birth mother as well. And she wrote the chapter as a vision, essentially, almost an outline or a proposal for an imaginary book. But she used it both in its form and its content to disrupt, to push, to imagine different ways of being and caring. And so as the final chapter in the book, it both acknowledges the colonial history in our country and the devastating impact on Indigenous peoples, but is also a celebration of children, of storytelling, and of this full spectrum of mothering. And so we were incredibly fortunate as editors to have the range of submissions that people put in, and to be able to, I mean, there is a Canadian focus without a doubt, but it's not exclusively Canadian, and to be able to find a way with the support of a nice independent press like Demeter to, whoops, there we go, to explore some of those themes was really just a great privilege. And while it may be chronologically the first, Andrea, it actually did come out last fall. So we were in full pandemic, and we were working with you, you know, through the proofs and everything in those first 6 months of the pandemic. It's definitely been quite a ride.
Yes, I apologize. We're during the pandemic. That just seems like 5 years ago. I think there's like different stages of the pandemic, but yes, you came out last fall, which was, I don't know, was that the second wave? But yes, so thank you. And yeah, and I have to, again, I'll say it again, but you know, these editors, you know, they had kids at home, you know, they were dealing with elder care, and you know, some had COVID, some got sick, their families did, and you know, they did it, and I can't, you know, it was kind of guilt inducing for me to be on the editors. We got to meet a deadline, but yeah, to do this under such impossible situations anyway, as mothers and activists and academics in our crazy busy lives, but to have this during the pandemic. So thank you to you and your contributors, because the book got out in time and on time. So thank you.
Thanks to Demeter, and thank you for organizing this as well at Yama's conference. This is a wonderful gathering.
So yeah, Katie, I think I'm going to go in chrono, and I apologize. I'm going to go in chrono, and I'm just, I'll do my books last if there's time. But I guess the next up, so that was November 20, and then I guess the next publication would have been March 21, and that would have been Fiona and I's co-edited book on mothers mothering COVID-19. So I'll pass it over to Fiona.
Thanks, Andrea, and hello, everybody. And thanks to Katie and your team for organizing this conference. I know it's been extraordinary amount of work and labor and commitment. And so I thank everyone who has done all of the work to make this possible. And I'm very aware of the amount of work that it takes. I'd also like to start by, like Lorna, acknowledging where I'm located. While I teach at the University of Winnipeg, and really respect, Lorna, your introduction about Winnipeg and the traditional lands and the importance of making these land acknowledgements. Currently, I'm located on the West Saanich territories, which I guess colonially known is just north of Victoria on Vancouver Island. And the First Nations, which is closest to me, are the Thakam First Nation. So I just want to acknowledge that, and to also say that I'm an immigrant. I came to Canada as a 6-year-old, and I'm very well aware of the history of our pass and reserve system as being the template for apartheid in South Africa. And I think a lot of Canadians don't recognize that, don't know it. And like we are learning, unfortunately, through the unearthing of undocumented graves and bodies, much of Canadian history is buried. And I don't say that lightly. It's whitewashed. I'm using these words very consciously. And it's important that we acknowledge and recognize the theft of land and water, and our government, our country, our nation, and our citizens as settlers and visitors have a lot of work to do in reconciling this abhorrent history. So I want to start there. And one last thing I'll say, kind of maybe this is a segue into COVID, because this book that Andrea and I have co-edited together was born out of the insanity of COVID. But being here, I have to say, I feel so incredibly privileged, because the case numbers have not been very high. There's lots of land and space in, again, traditional Indigenous land, I acknowledge that. But my ability to keep somewhat grounded, I think, was much easier here than if I had been in Winnipeg, particularly through the winter time. So I acknowledge where I am, and I'm so very grateful to be here. So I can, and Andrea, please step in anytime. Andrea and I, well, like my first book with Demeter Press, Andrea said, Fiona, this time she said, I'd like to, I think, we should co-edit a book on COVID. We were talking a little bit back and forth, and I certainly was following Andrea's posts on Facebook and the creation of a group on Facebook around mothers and COVID. And I was alarmed by what was happening. And also, like Andrea, so aware of the lack of acknowledgement in the press and in mainstream media, as well as even on social media, except for mothers talking to mothers, that there was no acknowledgement of the frontline worker situation that mothers were finding themselves in, and everything was falling, not everything, but mostly to mothers. And as Lorna has noted, this is gendered labor. So it's, women giving up work or working and homeschooling and caring for their children, and also making space in their homes for their own work or their spouse's work or their kids' work. And mothers with young children, mothers with adult children, suddenly adult kids are coming home and are either going to university from the kitchen table or working from their bedrooms. And then thinking about mothers who have no home, how are mothers dealing with those situations? And so Andrea asked if I'd be interested. I said, without hesitation, absolutely. And we knew it would be intense, and we put a call out and received well over 100 submissions. I think, Andrea, you can correct me, I think it was the fastest and most responses ever for any Demeter publication or call. And there were so many responses that we were actually able to also publish a double issue of the journal of JMI, which was focused on academic mothering and COVID. So that tells you the kind of response that we had. And we turned this around within 10 months of putting the call out, which was incredible. And incredible on there were 45 separate submissions, like chapters or illustrations, poetry, and more than that. I can't remember, Andrea, the actual number of people who participated. 65, maybe more.
Sorry, it was 70.
70 people. 70 people committed to this project and did it within 10 months. And there was a lot of work going back and forth, and everybody worked really, really hard on it. And I'm just going to look at the intro because I want to be sure to be accurate about this. The compilation embraces diverse voices from a variety of global locations. These include those of Indigenous mothers, grandmothers, and daughters living on Turtle Island, as well as the voices of mothers living in Australia, Brazil, Canada, India, Korea, Mexico, Spain, South Asia, the United Kingdom, the United States. So I think it gives you an idea of the range of geographical locations where people were writing from. And that's right, 70 authors and artists engaged with historical, cultural, philosophical, intersectional, and sociological perspectives to reflect upon the associated gamut of emotions and experience of mothers during these COVID-19 times. And some of the collections divided into 3 sections: mothering and wage labor, mothers and care work, and maternal health and well-being, which is a theme, again, Lorna, that you talked about in your own work. And it's so important to recognize the persistence and the support that's needed, but also the support that's given by mothers. So the voices were varied.
Some of the pieces were incredibly raw, very emotional. Some were very personal. There was dialogue between mothers that was shared. There were the more what you would expect, sort of as scholarly or academic research project. There was poetry, photography. The cover of the book is absolutely beautiful. It's actually embroidery that's done, and the piece is called Taming the Virus, and it's just amazing. And it's by Catherine Muller. And Catherine also has a piece in the book, which is a really heartfelt piece talking about dealing with being the parent and mother of a child who's transitioning, and what that's all about. There are pieces in there of mothers talking about their own mental health. I'm thinking particularly of this last section on maternal health and well-being, but also looking after the mental health and well-being of their family, and then having to advocate outside of the family, because as we all know, during COVID, we were totally isolated. And so getting support for children or other family members who needed support, and then being judged by the medical practitioner or the system that's supposed to be supportive, and in one case turns around and blames the mother for the mental health situation that's going on within the home. And so the only option was to either be in lockdown with a child who was violent, or give over the child to an institution, and the mother would not be allowed to be there. Birthing within COVID was addressed, working within COVID. There were voices of experiences of immigrants in Canada and suddenly being cut off, and what that meant in terms of trying to homeschool their children and not being able to speak the language of English, which was the English that children were being taught in, and not being able to support them. So there's a huge range of pieces. And it really was taking a snapshot of what was going on in those first 10 months. And they're incredibly powerful pieces. And one of our hopes for this collection is that it's a snapshot, and that it will be a resource going forward. And I'm even thinking now we're in our fourth wave, right? Like, I don't know how many more waves there are going to be of this pandemic. When will it not be a pandemic and we'll simply be living with the virus like we live with the flu virus? Who knows when that will be called, but the fact remains is that mothers still are doing the massive share of caring and pivoting and into school with kids, bringing kids home from school, trying to figure out their own working situations if they're working or working at home or working outside of home. So I think it's really a substantial piece, which we can come back to and look at. And I think often, and maybe it's an analogy like childbirth, it's incredibly life-altering and profound. Yet when we're 2 months away from it, we kind of forget the intensity of it and what it was all about. So I think that in having these written during the time is a really good way of capturing what was going on, rather than reflections back. Of course, those are important and we will have those, but I think having this documented, and the subtitle is Dispatches from a Pandemic, and that's what it feels like. Reading these pieces, it really does feel like they're dispatches. A lot of the authors talk about the isolation and it's almost like not a cry for help, but it's like sending out, this is what's happening, and it needs to be documented. And I have to say that I was concerned that this might have been the call going out at this time might have been an extra onerous layer. but the response told us, and certainly there were a couple of people who told me I'd love to, but I can't fathom doing anything other than, getting up and having a shower and feeding my kid. And I totally acknowledge that. However, this also was a lifeline for some of the contributors in feel like they were being heard, and they knew that their voices and contributions were going to be respected, believed, and it was validation and affirming what their life experiences were at the time. Andrea, is there anything else you want to say?
No, you said it brilliantly, but I do think it's a moment in time, because now we're, talking about, where do we go from here, building back better, that's the language, but we need to know what happened at that moment. And I really think that's what is so important and unique about the book. It's, yes, we rushed it. I mean, but I still think the writing is stellar. I mean, maybe we could have spent more time, but it was like call for papers went out July 1st. The book was published in March. So it was and during a pandemic. But it's that, I just think that is so important, because as you look back at things, time edits and filters memory, right? And this is in the moment. So I think I'm hoping that it's a record of what happened, but it's a record from which to learn from. And we actually end our introduction with that. This didn't just happen. It wasn't cataclysmic and awful and we'll put it behind us and go on. No, we want to keep returning to this because we need to learn from this. It shows, a lot of people said the pandemic, cast a neon light on what was happening, which we already know. We already know mothers were overburdened, overworked, and undervalued, but the pandemic forced us to look, right? So I'm really hoping that, we can use this, not just to document, which is absolutely crucial, but also to use that data to understand what we can learn from this moment, right? What, in most cases, what went wrong. There was some art chapters that were very actually up, that some good things came from the pandemic. But overwhelming, it was just showing we're already at the cliff, and the pandemic just pushed us over the cliff. So what can we learn from, as we fall from the cliff, to build a better world? And I know that's cliche, but I do think that's for me. I mean, I've been rereading it because I'm now teaching the book in my courses. And we can learn a lot from this, not just to show what happened in those moments, but we got to reread this to figure out how we can return to a better normal, right? So yeah, it's very raw and very hard reading. But I think really, I don't want to say accurate, but in the moment, right? It isn't filtered through retrospective analysis. It just is what happened, right? I mean, it was edited and re-edited. All the editors did 4 or 5 versions. I mean, it wasn't just raw that we published what they wrote, but the emotions were unfiltered. It was recording the moment, not retrospectively. And I think that's really crucial, as if we're going to learn from this and hopefully learn from it better. So thank you, Fiona. And thank you for being such an amazing editor. There was many long nights and many Zoom meetings going through all the jobs.
Always a pleasure, Andrea. Always a pleasure working hard with you. I love it. Thank you. Unmute yourself, Andrea.
You think I'd have this down by now, right? Sorry, I apologize. Tolu, we're at Olu Pearce, and your title came out, I believe, July 21, so quite recent.
Okay, good evening. Yeah, I'm a new author with Demeter Press, and I'm here in Columbia, Missouri. I'm originally from Nigeria, although I did all my college education and graduate work in the US. I went back home to teach and then came back here in '95. And I think I joined Mercy in 2011, I think it was. Okay, so I'm kind of a newcomer. So with regard to where I am, here in Missouri, I'm still learning things about the original owners. this land. A couple of years ago, I was on a panel about the Osage group and how they've been slaughtered and everything. So I guess, you know, we all have a lot of things to learn. And as you have said, recognizing what has gone before. I would like to start by talking about how I got into this, and then a little bit about the structure of the book and everything. In 2013, I was working on an article which actually was later published by African Studies Journal in Canada. And I was working on the gender inequality among the Yoruba, because I have an ongoing argument with many of my other African feminists who keep saying that motherhood makes us equal within the African context. And I've always said no. But anyway, while I was writing that article, I came across the work of one Robert Moraes, a South African pro-feminist who just hit the African feminists, and Nigerian feminists in particular, saying that we always talk about motherhood and we shy away from talking about masculinities. It's like, you know, that why talk about one without the other? And that really struck me. So the 2016 Mercy conference that we had, okay, and I was on the panel with Andrea, I decided to write a paper on motherhood and masculinities in Africa, trying to respond to Moraes' critique. And that paper went over quite well. And so I then got back to Andrea to say, how about my editing a book, you know, motherhood and masculinities, but globally? So she said, go right ahead. Okay, so that's how, you know, I came to work on this. And my co-editor is Andrea Moraes. She's in Canada. She was formerly a student here in Missouri, and then has relocated. When she got her PhD, I was on her dissertation committee, relocated to Canada. So that worked out quite well. And so we sent out a call for papers, and we got quite a few, you know, like over 20. We selected 10 and added our own 2. So there are 12 chapters in the book. The structure of the book is that, okay, it's in 3 parts. The first deals with cultural narratives, okay, looking at the construction of motherhood and the construction of masculinities. The second part deals with ethnographic research, and there's much overlap because it's often, you know, difficult. We just had to make up our minds which one we would put into the part 2. Now, part 3 deals with the post-colonial developments. Now, what was interesting about the responses we got is that we were very lucky to get responses from really around the world. From India, Armenia, of course, Africa, Canada, First Nations, US, African American, white, and so on. So we had quite a range, and I was, you know, very pleased about that. I think one thing that I would like to say is that it was of interest to me because I felt that very little had been done with the specific comparison between motherhood and masculinities. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that it has taken much longer for the study of masculinities to kind of catch up. You know, how the whole thing started was like not always a critical perspective. It was quite often anti-feminist. But we now have, you know, several pro-feminist writers, you know, people like, of course, everybody knows Connell, Rayward Connell, and then Hearn, Jeff Hearn, people like that have really, you know, stuck their neck out and argued that, you know, we shouldn't just be studying men, but masculinities as such. And, you know, one definitely is teaching this kind of thing in the courses. I'm teaching a course on women and human rights. And this, you know, one asks the question, what does masculinities have to do with women's human rights? And what has happened, of course, at both the national level and the UN is that countries are backtracking. Promises that they made in the 70s, they're no longer keeping up to those promises. And so it has been very difficult to move forward with this whole issue of masculinities. Anyway, with regard to the book itself, we did not specify any particular way that the authors, or you know, the authors should address it, so that they were given quite a free hand. And what is interesting is that we have focus on mothers and the masculinity of their sons. Okay, we have the study of the Hira in India, who are, you know, men born with male bodies who want to mother, and how they navigate, you know, motherhood and masculinity, and that sort of thing. And Tanzania, how masculinities have been kind of tempered by the women's response to neoliberal policies in which women had to develop organizations. And so when men lost their jobs, they actually now started working with their wives, and that really changed the whole relationship between motherhood and masculinity in that country. One of the chapters that really interested me a lot was the focus on women who are on the front fighting in Ethiopia, and how they navigate masculinities and motherhood and so on. So we had, you know, really quite a range of perspectives, interests, and so on. And in terms of the authors themselves, I would say that we also had a real range of people at different locations in their own careers. Some were freelancing, others were in academia. I would say that I'm the oldest, okay, I'm retired, and others were graduate students. Okay, so the whole range, you know, from graduate students and people who were freelancing but were like, you know, middle-aged, okay, in the middle of their careers, and then, you know, an elderly person like myself, working with the different authors was very interesting because it spanned the globe, and one had to work differently with people whose English was their second or third language. Okay, so there was a real difference. And so with some, you know, one had to work very, very closely with them. With others, they just hit the ground running, you know. Of course, you know, they had no problem. The American and Canadian scholars had no problem with the English, but everybody was very focused, okay, and we really didn't have any trouble getting the chapters back. You know, there was really no problem there. So so I think, you know, I'll leave it like that. Oh, the only other thing that I would like to add is one question that Katie put out, is that what can readers do to help alleviate the issues you discuss in your book? One interesting thing, okay, that if there is a thread, because they focus on so many different things, okay, but if there is a thread, the issue might be the extent to which motherhood has been constructed to uphold hegemonic masculinities at the individual level, among ethnic groups like, you know, the Yoruba, where I come from. At the national level, we had a chapter in which somebody talked about the way motherhood is being used to build the Indian nation as a Hindu, you know, strong men who are saving Mother India type of thing. And then motherhood is also used to solve the problems of soldiers coming back after war, you know, in Armenia and so forth. So of course, the issue is that in everyday life, we're told that it's the mothers who need protection. It is the mothers, you know, that men are the ones protecting the home and everything. But really, when you read these chapters, it basically is the other way around. Okay, it is you know, mothers who uphold their sons, husbands, soldiers, nations, and so on. How we have constructed it in such a way that you know, we've constructed it almost the opposite of what actually happens. That struck me as, you know, as I worked through the different chapters. And lastly, I would say that what we all need to do, I think, is stop and think of how we are contributing to the construction of masculinities. It's not something that is constructed in a vacuum, and it's not something that is constructed just by men or by institutions like Connell talks about a lot, but also how do we as mothers, sisters, and so on also help in constructing this you know, these various forms of masculinities. Especially, I think, you know, many of the chapters deal with what is now known as hegemonic masculinity, but we also help uphold it. Okay, we do, even as mothers. So, you know, maybe we can talk a little bit more about that in the question and answer time. But as I said, you know, this was a very rewarding experience. And I'm very pleased that Demeter Press, gave me the go-ahead, right, when I asked after writing that conference paper. Thank you.
And thank you. And I still remember very fondly us sitting at the table. And that's why, well, Zoom conferences are wonderful. That kind of organic thing just doesn't happen. And I was sitting beside her and I loved her paper so much. And I just leaned over and I said, "You're doing a book with Demeter Press." And she's like, "Oh, okay, I guess I am." Right? I don't think I asked. I think I could maybe just tell, but thank you for that. But I remember very fondly us sitting at that panel, and I loved your paper so much. And I said, "We haven't done a book on mothering and masculinities." And you were so right, how mothers can be so complicit unknowingly or unwittingly in the destruction of hegemonic masculinities. And that's where we have to intervene and upset that, right? So thank you for your contribution, and particularly for its global perspective, because that's a real commitment that we're working on in Demeter, is to become more global than we have been, and certainly are committed to that. So I guess we are now in September. This is this month, and Abby will talk about Monstrous Mothers. And the book was supposed to be out about a month ago, but there's what's happened. It's I don't really understand supply chain. I failed economics, but there's huge supply chain issues right now. So our books are now at the printers for 2 or 3 months, where they used to be 2 to 3 weeks. So it's nobody's fault. It's just a paper shortage, and it's just, I don't know. So I apologize. The book would have been out September 1st, but it is going to be out. Actually, it'll be out on Monday. So it'll be still out in September, but about 28 days late. So Abby, I pass it on to you.
Thank you, Andrea. Good evening, everyone. It's so lovely to see you all. I wish we were around a table. I am coming to you from the traditional lands of the Monacan people. I'm here in Virginia in the US. And Andrea, that timing is so intriguing. We're doing this on a Saturday evening, and my child was born on a Monday, and I remember that Saturday the night before, like the anticipation, we were almost there, and now we are almost there for this book, which has been just a labor of love. I know I'm director of the Women's Center at the university where I am now, but in my former position, I was a faculty member at a different institution where I frequently taught a course called Monstrous Mothers of Literature. And it was always so much fun and so intellectually invigorating and just emotionally so poignant to work with my students as they would read all of these novels. I typically taught it in the spring, and we would get to spring break and they'd be like, "I don't know if I can come back for the second half of the semester." And I would say, no, it's worth it. And by the end, they would agree. But that deep dive into representing mothers behaving monstrously, or mothers doing the best they could, but being labeled monstrous by society, was always such a powerful learning experience for them. So when I saw Andrea's call for editors in the spring of 2017, including asking for someone to do something on Monstrous Mothers, I jumped right on it. I don't even know what I dropped to email her right away. "Andrea, do you have someone? I want this one." And she thankfully wrote right back and said, "Nope, it's yours," which was fabulous. So I just said April of 17, Fiona, yours and Andrea's might have been the fastest book here. I think mine was the longest book, but that's a little bit of life, right? And I want to pause here for a moment to acknowledge and thank Lynn Barron, who I'm pretty sure is still on the call. Lynn worked with me on the first half of the process with this book, to shape the call for papers and to select the contributors for it. And then just the extended time period, it didn't work for her to finish it with me. And so Andrea stepped in as the other co-editor. So my thanks to Lynn for her help on the beginning, and to Andrea for her help with the end birthing of the book. So I don't have it in my hand yet, but if Katie is able to give me permission to screen share, I would love to show you a copy of the cover, because the image that we have for it is just stunning. Thanks, Katie. Okay. I'm going to have to flip to a different tab. Do not look at how many tabs I have open. It's a little scary. There we go. So this image for our cover just every time I look at it, my breath is taken away. This is by a local artist here in Charlottesville named Tobiah Munt. And Andrea and I we pretty much gotten the shape of the book together, and we started thinking about the cover. And Mother's Day of 2020, Tobiah shared that image on her Instagram feed and titled it "The Mother, period, a war mask in progress." And I screenshotted it and emailed it to Andrea right away. And I said, "What do you think of this?" And she said, "Yes." Many exclamation marks. I'm sure you can imagine her email, because that just captured the essence of what we were trying to do in the book. And that in progress piece of it seems so important, particularly for a book. As I said at the beginning, a minute or two ago, I say it in the introduction or the acknowledgements, it's been a labor of love. It was a painful coming to birth. It is not easy to sit with the mothers that our contributors look at so thoughtfully and ethically and empathetically, but to look at their behaviors, to sit with those for years, it brings home the challenges that mothers face in their mother work. I want to pause though and say this painful coming to birth, the challenges these books have faced over COVID are not new, right? It's amplified, but Andrea, as you were talking, I was reminded, that's why I had this other image up, of the work of bringing Mothers, Mothering, and Globalization to print. You may or may not remember, but 25% of the authors in that book were impacted by the series of hurricanes that came through that summer. They had no electricity, they had no internet. I was texting edits to people and they were saying, yes, go for it. And so I emphasize that just to remind us of the resiliency and the commitment and the passion that the editors and the contributors to the books that Demeter Press puts out there, that dedication to the work that we all do. So just a real fast overview of Monstrous Mothers. It's looking at literature, TV, movies, media accounts, both of mothers misbehaving, but also mothers being judged as misbehaving, and really trying to unpack those differences. We divided it into 3 sections: precarious mothering, maternal violence, and then mothers made monstrous. And honestly, I had to look that up before this evening, because one of the things that working on this book taught me is that the process of writing a book, of bringing it from that initial germ of an idea to the book that's going to be in my hands any minute, that really is a journey. And that end product sometimes looks exactly like you thought it would when you started with that germ of an idea. But I think so often when the process is entered into with vulnerability and authenticity, what you end up with the end is not what you ever necessarily could have dreamed of, but hopefully is the thing that the universe intends to have out there for people to read and engage with. So I cannot even tell you how many different times we reordered chapters. Some folks had fabulous ideas that they were going to contribute, and then life intervened and they weren't able to. And then we found others to fill that space, or to take up a different space. So we reorganized multiple times. But when that book is in my hands, I already am so proud of it. I cannot wait to actually hold it here. Ultimately, I would say that we are unpacking the cultural weight that mothers are made to bear in this book, and really trying to untangle what is monstrous maternal behavior from mothers who are being treated as scapegoats. The 12 chapters together, plus the introduction and the coda, they work to reckon with the cultural norms that allow us to depict mothers as monstrous, right? Like, we may not all be mothers, but we all have a mother. And so what is it that society in so many different locations across geography and time is interested in depicting mothers, that person we all have in common, is so interested in depicting them as monstrous. I think I want to stop there because I want to hear from Andrea as well. But I'll just say, please go read the book, because our contributors poured their blood, sweat, and tears into their chapters. So thank you.
Thank you, Abby. And time is fleeting. My goodness. So I'm going to be very quick. I think many of you know I was on sabbatical last year. Both a good and bad time to be on sabbatical, I suppose. I had all these very glamorous plans. I was actually going to go to 12 conferences in 12 countries. And, I was really excited. And then the pandemic hit. And then I moved to the bush where I'm still living. And I'm now living here permanently. So we built a cottage in 2018 before it was done, not knowing ever that this would be my home. My partner retired. We're going to kind of live here. He was going to live here. I was going to come up here whenever, and then he'd come back whenever, and we'd hopefully make it work financially. It was tough. But thought, we'll do it for now and then sell eventually. Well, then the pandemic came in March 2020, and I moved here. I was in the States when the pandemic was called. I came here. I came home. I came up here with 6 cats and my son, and I really haven't left, right? So I've been here for 20 months. And obviously all my sabbatical plans that were to be July 1, 2020, obviously evaporated, right? Completely, everything went. So I say all that because, what do you do if you're, and people who know me or see my Facebook page, I really am in the bush. I'm not embellishing here. I live on a dirt road. I mean, I do have indoor plumbing, but it's very remote. The town has 200 people. And I've been here for now 20 months. So what do you do during a sabbatical in the bush? Well, you think about mothering. So I devoted my sabbatical to doing things that I had promised myself I would do. And couldn't in the busyness of teaching and how our lives become so full. So the first thing I want to speak to, and this is probably my proudest accomplishment of my sabbatical, and I have to kind of grunt to lift it up, but I published the second edition of Maternal Theory. Yes, and it's Tracy, who works for me, you all know Tracy, who's amazing. She's been our admin assistant forever. And she said, Andrea, can you please start publishing smaller books? Because she has to carry them to the post office, right? And pay the exorbitant fee of shipping these. But anyway, the first edition of Maternal Theory came out in 2007. Motherhood studies and maternal thinking were really just coming into being then. I was teaching a course. I was using one of those course kits that kept falling apart. And I thought, no, I'm going to do a book. Like it was it was Demeter's fourth publication. It was one of our earliest publications. And I just said, I'm publishing this book because my course needs it. And it's a big course. I have 100 to 150 students. So I thought, well, some guaranteed sales, I can justify this cost. Anyway, long story short, I think the book served well. It went through 3 printings. I think the book sold 4,000 print copies and 4 times that probably in ebooks. But then this is something I've been telling myself I had to do for the last 5 years and putting it off because I really didn't want to do it because I knew how much work it was. So anyway, in the snowstorm, I suppose, in the bush, I decided, okay, I can do this. And I decided to do a second edition, and it was hard because I had to remove some from the first edition. Like I couldn't just add on another 30. That would bring to 80, chapters, which would have been, unsustainable, both cost wise and mailing wise and even user wise. So I had the hard task of, cutting out of the original to allow for the new. And it was hard. And people who've got the edition, I hope I haven't cut one of your ones you really liked. I had a lot of sleepless nights deciding, which ones I should keep, which ones need to go. I have to open up space. So anyway, long story short, I decided to do this. And then I had the other hard task of thinking, okay, what are the new topics? What should we be talking about in 2021 in the 14 years since the book first came out? And that was a hard slog again, just kind of thinking and reading. And so I came up with 30 new topics that I thought have evolved really. When you think about a short period of time, 14 years is not that long, but in those 14 years, these topics had emerged in maternal theory that weren't there in '07. So I did decide upon the topics that I picked 30 new ones, and it's so random and arbitrary, it's me, right? So somebody else would have done this book, would have come up with another 30, I'm sure. And then I had the hard task of finding writers, right? So I'm very blessed. Again, this is during a pandemic. I decided to do this in December and the book came out in July. So I started writing to people, you know, in December, January, and begging, pleading, cajoling, bargaining, negotiating for them to submit a chapter. So I'm really excited. The book, as I said, just came out in July. I'm using it in my undergrad and graduate course. So I'm excited how I shouldn't say I'm excited. I don't know yet. We're still reading the old stuff because we're only 2 weeks into the term. But yeah, really exciting new stuff. We have a chapter on non-binary parenting. We have a chapter on trans parenting. We have a new chapter on reproductive justice. We have a chapter on pandemic mothering. Topics that I think would have been, I wouldn't say unimaginable in '07, but certainly not in our consciousness, right? So the other thing we did, I just say maternal regret. I did a chapter on that. Abby contributed one on monstrous moms. We have Nicole's chapter on feminist fathering. We have an updated, beautifully updated chapter on Indigenous mothering. Jennifer Brandt, who's actually speaking at this conference, and Kim Anderson did do a chapter in the original, but they said, no, we've got to update this from '07 to now, right? Which they did brilliantly. We have one, as I said, on queer possibilities. And I said, and we have a chapter first time on non-motherhood, women who choose to be child-free. We have one on the adoption mandate. We have one on the motherhood memoir, which was coming into being in '07, but really became, you know, a central theme or issue in maternal theory since then. We have one on the opt-out revolution and one on the juggling mother. So yeah, I had to think about, you know, what did we leave out in '07, what's happened since then, and what do we need to include in the second edition to capture as best as I could, you know, the huge, I think, achievements that's happened to maternal theory in a very, very short period of time. And I was writing it, I just kept thinking of Adrienne Rich, and she, you know, I mean, that's a book I reread every year, and the third edition is now out. And, you know, remember, she opens A Woman Born, which is now coming up to 50 years old, or soon to be, that, you know, calling for the need for maternal studies, maternal motherhood studies, you know, to put mothering at the center of scholarship, you know, or even maybe not center, but at least please begin talking about it. That was her call out. So I end my intro with these words. I end it with, the second edition is even bigger than the first. As I prepared this collection, I was reminded of my teenage self. Okay, I'm really dating myself here. I was reminded of my teenage self trying to select my favorite songs for a 90-minute cassette tape. I could not cut my beloved songs then, nor could I edit my must-read list today. So I found myself left with this mammoth text of maternal theory, truly an embarrassment of riches. However, remembering Rich's lament on the absence of maternal scholarship 45 years ago, I see such an abundance as most appropriate. That we have created such a vast and diverse tradition of maternal theory in 4 decades is a huge achievement and a cause for celebration indeed. So it was just for me to keep this tradition going and for it to be growing so expansively and inclusively, for me was, it did my heart good. So shout out again to the contributors who did the impossible.
Andrea, I think you went back on mute for a second.
Yeah, we talked too long again, Katie, but if you want to ask a few questions,
Actually, well, I mean, at this point, I think it's totally fair. If anybody else would like to chime in with questions, of course, I have some ready, that so much interesting information, and it's hard to come up with questions that can pull all of this together because of the wide-reaching nature, I think. But one of the questions I had as other people were perhaps thinking of their own, and please use the chat box if you would like to chime in with either a comment or a question, is that, and I think this speaks very much to your work, Andrea, for many years now, of addressing the silences in academia, but also in public discourse. And so this question goes to everybody, that why do you think that the issues that you raised in your work haven't been either addressed fully or haven't been addressed in the ways that your text has chosen to engage with those topics happened before? And again, you know, anybody is free to chime in with this, because I think it's something that each of you is bringing a new perspective, and in some cases to a topic that is very, very rarely covered either in academic or public discourse.
Maybe I can jump in. I don't think, I wouldn't say our book fully got there, because this is such a rich, deep issue. But there's something about the way so many different societies are afraid of mothers behaving in a way that doesn't match whatever the norm is. In the coda, Andrea started to talk about, Andrea, I'm like totally blanking on the phrase you used for it. Normative, there we go. Normative mothering. And we make mothers take care of so many things in so many different realms of society that I think there's this unarticulated fear that mothers will stop doing all that work because the world will then fall apart. So there's something really, really threatening about mothers who behave monstrously. And it's really easy to just write them off and just they're crazy or they're an aberration. But I'm sorry, not as fully articulate as I thought maybe I'd be when I jumped in there. But we do really fear mothers who misbehave. I think because if mothers can misbehave and throw off those normative expectations, that means they can walk away from mothering. And where are we left if we still need our mother?
I think that was very well articulated, Abby. I mean, because we
Found it at the end.
about issues that are part of our collective unconscious in a way that, and that is what academia in many ways is charged with, is bringing the unconscious to the conscious. But then, I mean, how do you, and I was one of the early readers of that book, and I remember, you know, the way that you're trying to tease out these assumptions, but that means, of course, naming assumptions that we already assume. So that's sort of getting out of that circle can be sometimes, I think, very challenging. Tolu, you were also, if you don't mind, in my mind when I was thinking of that question.
Yes, and one thing that runs through several of the chapters is the whole idea of making sure that mothers behave themselves sexually, and you know, and that runs through it, because the honor of the family, the honor of the sons and fathers and nation, and it just went all the way up. People are really worried if mothers don't behave, you know, with the proper, you know, for example, in one of the chapters, the son told that, you know, was angry with the mother because at his wedding she danced with 3 different men, you know, type of thing. So mothers are not supposed to exhibit that kind of behavior. So it's not just the fathers who can monitor their mothers, sons can monitor the mother in a way that daughters cannot monitor their fathers. Okay, I mean, that kind of the honor of the family, the honor of the ethnic group, or even the nation. The one on India really goes into that. So, I think that is really part of the problem. Not just the mothers won't do the work they're supposed to do, but that we will be less than vis-a-vis some other group if our mothers don't behave well.
Thank you for that. Yes, and I've thought of that too, even in terms of so often, the references to, it at least ubiquitously in US movies, the sort of, the father leaves the land of some sort of the home and says to the 8-year-old son, well, you're the man of the house now. Like, well, what happened there, sort of thing. And the way that sort of gets conveyed, of course, and possibly to boys who don't even necessarily want to carry that, but yet we put it on them anyway. So one of the things with IMS, our name stands for the International Association of Maternal Action and Scholarship. And so in our closing minutes today, I wanted to ask each of you, if there was one action or something that somebody could do to alleviate the problem that is present in your book, what would you recommend? And so I figured we could just kind of go around fairly quickly, unless we have other people that wanted to have a comment or something, a question in the chat box. I'd be happy to participate with those too. But that was our closing question typically, and then I'd hand it over to anybody who wants to pick that up first.
I'll start. Andrea and I had a wonderful interview with Marcy Marcuse on CBC Radio Winnipeg around Mother's Day. And something both Andrea and I said was that we need to be valuing mothers and making the work and the labor that mothers do visible. And on Mother's Day, really celebrate in a way, not just on that day, but every other day, and not celebrate, but actually contribute to acknowledging the labor, taking on some of that labor. And one of the suggestions, and I don't know if I think I wrote it down, I don't even know if I got to say this, but when someone asks how they can support or help, I think mothers need to say, not just one, like, oh, do the shopping for me, or, like one sort of favor, but ask for a continual contribution. So that might be making sure that the car is full of gas every week. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to ask you about it. I just want the car to be full of gas. Or, do the grocery shopping and don't depend on me for the list. Or give me 2 hours off every Saturday so I can go do whatever I feel like, and I don't have to tell you where I'm going or what I'm doing. Like, I feel like others contributing, and not other women, not other mothers. Like these are, other folks who are supported by mothers all the time. So it may be a sibling, it may be another child, it may be, someone else to step in and take on the labor, not just as like a one-off, like actually do that other mothering work that we all really crave and need, and is so vital to raising children anyway, right? Having a village. So I would suggest that that might be one, and IMAS might promote that. I linking it back to the organization, but concrete responses that are helpful and meaningful. Like a box of chocolates is nice, but come on, like 2 hours every Saturday is much better.
And I will speak about my maternal theory book. I'm actually teaching this term a graduate course, maternal theory. I haven't taught it for some years, and I have 16 people. It's the biggest grad course right now in my department. It's like, all the naysayers out there who said nobody was interested in this. My course is more than the sexuality course. So there you go. Mothers are more interested in sex. So that's very validating. But for me, it was a graduate student. She said she took the course because she was really confused. I said, well, what does that mean? And she said, because you had maternal in front of theory. And I said, because that's what my course is called, the graduate level maternal theory. That's all it's called. I don't say anything else, just maternal theory. And she said, how can the maternal be theory? And how can the theory be maternal? And, you know, she's a PhD student. She said, and so I opened my course as, you know, if you studied motherhood, in which way and what, from what perspective? And of course, the answer is no, I've never studied it. If I have, it's generally been negative. And she's, you know, she says she's taken all these theory courses, and she was just so perplexed and bewildered that there was something called maternal theory, right? Even though she had taken many, many theory courses. And of course, there was nothing on motherhood studies or any concept of that there could be a tradition of maternal theory. So for me, that's my, you know, that I think that this second edition certainly proves there is a theoretical tradition of maternal theory, just like there is with liberal feminism, just like there is with psychoanalytic feminism or psychoanalytic feminist theory, that just, I don't know how to do it. I've been working on it for 2+ decades. But, you know, to make this more visible, so I don't have a student show up in my classroom in 2021 who's a PhD student in feminist theory and couldn't even imagine how the maternal and theory could go together in a course description. And she wasn't being rude or provocative. She was dumbfounded, but she was so interested. So she's, you know, we were only 3 weeks in, but she's liking the course. But I want to really normalize or regularize or visibilize maternal theory as a legitimate, valuable, as relevant theoretical tradition of feminist theory as the multitude of other feminist traditions. And there's many, I'm not saying it has to replace it, but if we can have, you know, if she can do a whole 26-week on, you know, Foucauldian feminism and Freudian feminism and I don't know what other feminism, and not even have mentioned a whole robust tradition of maternal feminist theory, that's shocking to me. So I want that to become part of and regularized in graduate curriculums, undergraduate courses. I don't know if it will happen, but we have to break in somehow and get these, you know, people should be reading Ruddock on their comprehensive exams in feminist theory. They're not, right? So how do we get, you know, the canon of maternal theory into the curriculum at both undergraduate and graduate level universities?
I'm going to jump in and say, you know, a nice antidote, I think, to austerity is a basic income. And the idea that everyone who is mothering can have some choice about where and when and how they mother. And so to get away from all of the value-driven choices about who is allowed to have enough to feed themselves and to have shelter and all of that. And so I guess political action is what it's going to take. And damn, it's time we got to be loud and maybe monstrous in that way. Let us start being monstrous and demanding that mothering is visible and valuable and take, I mean, we've just, as Andrea said, and the COVID collection says, we've just had it, I mean, we've known it all along, but it's been laid absolutely bare by the pandemic, how much the world depends on the work that mothers do.
Absolutely, Lorna. And that's like the perfect segue for me for what I was going to say for the Monstrous Mothers book, which would be, and I say this with all gentleness because I do the same thing myself, for us to stop apologizing when we're mothering. So 2 days worth of this conference so far, I'm not even sure how many times I've heard someone apologize because their child has wandered onto the screen, or they had to be feeding them, or they had to go off camera to do something. And so when we apologize because we're sort of inconveniencing the world around us as we're mothering, that seems to me to be setting the stage for where we can really, really blame mothers for anything they're doing, which then just makes it so much easier to label maternal action as monstrous. So to claim our space and take up our space and not say like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm doing this mothering, but like, hell yes, I'm mothering. And, you know, aren't you glad you can see it happening?
Did we address everybody? Did we go all the way around? Okay, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't leaving anybody out. So we are just over time, but if there are any last comments or questions from the audience? I want to make sure that we do give space for that.
Katie, I just want to say there was a couple of questions in chat about Demeter. Yes, we are available as ebooks. So somebody asked about that. Yeah, we are completely available by ebook.
Oh, you're on mute again.
Okay. You think I'd know better? Sorry, I unmuted and muted and unmuted. Yes, I just want to say that it was in the chat that some people were asking about Demeter and ebooks. Yes, we are completely, all our titles are available on ebooks from all the platforms in all the world. So whatever country you're in, whether it's Amazon.com, Amazon.ca, or I mean, I'm not an ebook person, so I don't know all the platforms. I don't do it. We have a distributor that does that. But yes, our books are available. And they're also available not just as ebooks, but they're available just to read a chapter. You know, although I don't really understand it, you know, we get 3 cents because somebody read an article, right? So all that, you can access any Demeter article, either as a chapter rather, or its book in its entirety through any library system in the world. Or you can purchase it as an ebook if you want it. So I just want to clarify that. I mean, we print our titles, and ebooks, we don't make any really money on ebooks because the cost is so minimal what we end up getting in our hands. But yes, we're completely available by ebooks. And I know a lot of people, particularly in the pandemic, that is the mode of understandably of reading. But I want to thank Katie. I just want to say to Katie that you have been a sister in supporting Demeter, and I deeply appreciate that you've created time at your jam-packed conference this year and last to create a space for us and to promote Demeter. So thank you for that. You could have, you didn't have to, and so thank you for making space for us.
Of course, and it's so wonderful to hear throughout so many of the talks various Demeter titles being referenced and people saying, oh yes, of course, I've read that too, and that sort of thing. That, I mean, you've built a community in so many different ways, but through that press alone, I think you've achieved remarkable things. And so, of course, the gratitude and the humble awe, basically, of what you've accomplished is always there. And I know everybody in here feels the same of what you've accomplished in terms of putting motherhood studies and matricentric feminism on the map. You are a force to be reckoned with. And I'm very glad that you're on our team in terms of making that happen. And to everybody who's joined us tonight, I know you're also very much rooting for the success of Demeter. I've posted the various books in the chat box there, but of course you can go to Demeter Press itself and purchase any of the books or ebooks. I believe that Andrea would support me in saying that going through the press itself is always preferred over outside venues. But if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to contact Andrea, any of the various editors here, or myself in terms of follow-up questions. But being that it is the end of day 2 of this conference, yep, I think we're going to wrap up.
But just one final shout out. I'm not sitting at a table beside Tolu right now and and say, I want to publish your book. So if you have an idea for a Demeter collection, we can't be meeting over coffee or wine to discuss, but maybe next year. But in the meantime, do send me an email. That's how these books come to be. It's always organic and serendipitous, right? So if something comes up, even at the conference that maybe you didn't publish, but say, this came up, Andrea's a topic at the conference. Demeter needs to do a book on this. Please, any ideas, any authors? I think that's how the press stays new and relevant, is because it comes out of discussions at conferences like yours, Katie.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And to
okay, thank you.
Good night.
Everybody get rested and see you tomorrow morning.